Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day 2 of the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum presented by TD. The title of today's talk is The Indigenous Experience, discussing the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For those unfamiliar and for those watching at home, the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum began as a speaker and panel series that was shared as an excellent platform for sharing experiences, knowledge, and practical solutions necessary to address issues of racism and discrimination, and is structured around UNESCO's Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism. So for today's topic, according to the Native Women's Association of Canada, and although Indigenous women and girls make up only 3% of the female population in Canada, they represent over 10% of all female homicides in Canada. On December 9th, 2015, the newly elected Canadian government upheld their campaign promise to instate a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. After pre-inquiry meetings with a variety of people, including families, frontline workers, the provinces and Indigenous organizations from December 2015 through February 2016, earlier this month, the Government of Canada launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls independent from the federal government. We are here to discuss that inquiry and the history, present, and the future possibilities that lie in here as a result. Alrighty, it is my privilege to introduce our moderator first. So we have Jill Croteau making her way to the stage. Jill is an award-winning journalist for Global News, and she has been recognized for her undercover work exposing substance abuse on construction work sites and for a hidden camera investigation at nightclubs accused of racial profiling. So definitely a lot of journalistic integrity and a lot to offer to the table. And starting with our panelists, we have Deborah Green, who is a diversity specialist and strategist. She is a Cree woman from the Kawakatus First Nation in Saskatchewan with blood relatives of the Piapot First Nation, and she has been instrumental in increasing workforce diversity, representation for organizations, and is a valuable resource for inclusion and diversity strategies. Next, we have Nicole Robertson, President and Chief Communications Advisor of Musqueam Productions and Consulting. In 2002, Nicole created and established Musqueam Productions and Consulting to specialize in communication advisory services that include media and public relations, media training, event and video production, and communication strategies. In 2009, she was awarded with the Alberta Chamber of Commerce Aboriginal Woman Entrepreneur Award for Distinction, which recognizes the outstanding achievement by an Aboriginal woman entrepreneur who exemplifies effective leadership, innovation, and a commitment to enhancing the well-being of the larger Aboriginal community. And last but certainly not least, we have the Honourable Richard Feehan as our last panelist. He is the Alberta Minister of Indigenous Relations and MLA of Edmonton, Rutherford. He's dedicated over a decade of his life to teaching at the Edmonton Division of the University of Calgary's Faculty of Social Work. He has also spent more than a decade of experience in private social work practice. His extensive community involvement also includes volunteering with arts, sports, and school programs, and with numerous community organizations. So I will now turn it to our moderator and our panelists for some opening statements, and then we will follow it up with a Q&A, which always gets interesting. So thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. This topic, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, is sometimes even hard to say. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to think about. But I think that we shouldn't be shying away from these uncomfortable topics. I think this is something not only that we should be talking about, but that we need to be talking about. I think a lot of people will tell you, well, it's too late. Women are lost. These sisters have already been stolen. But I do think that the time is now and that we can be their voices. And I'm really humbled and honored to be a part of this conversation because I think that it's just worthy of our attention. And I just want to take a minute to thank the panelists for committing to this and to thank all of you in the audience for being here because I think that your presence is really a testament to the will to want to change this because I think that again, I can't understate it, that I do think that we should be talking about this and keep the conversation going. So I am looking forward to a really robust conversation about this controversial topic. I'm going to hand things over to Deborah.
All right, so my name is Deborah Green. My spirit name is Eternal Spirit Woman, and I haven't quite gotten it down pat how to say that in Cree, so I'm not going to try today. My sister would kill me if I butchered it. I'm from the Treaty 4 region, so Kwakdus First Nation, and a lot of relatives on the Paipot First Nation in Saskatchewan. And so as part of my opening statement, I just wanted to touch on what the inquiry means to me personally as an Indigenous woman. So I had a sister in 1982 who was taken outside the city in the dark winter night, minus 30 conditions, and she was left there to walk back with no coat on. So she died in the field trying to make it to a farmer's house. So she froze to death that night in the snow 34 years ago. And last year, she was just recently added to the MMIWG list. We don't expect a reopening of the case, and that not much probably would be found out 33 years later, in particular on who might have done that to her. There is speculation that it could have been what was known as the Starlight Tours at that time, which you can feel free to investigate. I also think the inquiry means that we're going to have some Canadian attention, but we'll get a lot of international attention and focus on this crisis in Canada, and that women are 3 to 6 times more likely to go murdered or missing than a non-Indigenous woman in Canada. So if you think about that statistic, that says a lot. So an inquiry will help us make perhaps some sustainable changes so that we can make sure this stops happening to our Indigenous women, that we can be safe and not at risk just because of who we are or the color of our skin. So there's a lot of work to do to make the inquiry fully scoped and meaningful, and I hope that the voices of Indigenous people, elders, and our traditional lawmakers are heard as well. So that's it for my opening statement.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you. I think this is a very important time in the history of Canada. We have a national tragedy that's been neglected for many years, and it's time that we got on board. And right now, I think that the hard work of many women in the Indigenous community has finally come to fruition on some level. The reason why it's happening now is because they got together, they told their stories to each other, they got active, they just demanded what was right and just. And it took a long time for Canada to catch up, but now I think the sort of the will of Canada is finally catching up with the will of the family members. And that took a long time, and that's part of the tragedy. But at the same time, I also want to say that there is some hope in all of this. And the hope is that they have been heard, have been listened to. And it won't be perfect, but we're at a pretty important time in the history of Canada. After a few hundred years of oppression and tragedy in many ways, we finally are at a place now where it feels to me like the world is calling for us to pay attention and to do some things. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has laid out some 94 recommendations on making some real substantive changes. And remember, they call them calls to action, not calls to conversation. And we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which again, written largely by Alberta and Canadian Indigenous people, but adopted throughout the world by the United Nations, again saying there are things we can do and it's time to move and do them. And now we have the Commission into the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And again, it's another calling. And it just seems to me that we are constantly being invited over and over again to pay attention, invited over and over again to do some self-reflection, and then over and over again to turn that reflection and that attention into action. And I'm glad, and I just say thank you to the Indigenous women of this country for being so persistent in making sure that it happened.
Thank you, Richard. Nicole?
So I'm honored to be here today on the lands of the Treaty 7 territory, and thank you for everyone that made it out on a beautiful sunny day today. I come from the Matthias Colomb Cree Nation, which is in northern Manitoba. I moved to Calgary approximately over 20 years ago and have adopted family from a Treaty 7 nation, the Piikani Nation in southern Alberta. I also have other adopted family up in the Musqueam in Treaty 6 territory. My background, of course, is being a storyteller. I've had to sit with many different people from our community that have been touched by this specific topic that we're talking about today with missing and murdered Indigenous women. I understand from my perspective as an Indigenous woman that things need to change. This inquiry we were pushing for decades, and know since time immemorial that our women were seen as subhuman, seen as less than, and it's time to change the narrative. There's no place in Canada for this nowadays, and as we look on social media, even weekly, you see a post that an Indigenous woman is either normally missing, or murdered. And so since the inquiry was called, there's been, I don't even know the number, but it's continuing. So it has to stop, and I realize that forums like this help to educate those that need that, and also for us to also tell our stories, our narratives, and it's important that we have more discussions that will help to bring healing as well. So thank you.
Thank you. We're here to talk a lot about this missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry. We talk about it as a really positive first step. This is sort of a government initiative, but at the core of it, it's a crime. We're talking about murder. We're talking about missing persons. And a lot of people criticize the police for their maybe perceived lack of involvement. So I'd like to ask you guys what you think about that piece of it, that part of where the police, in my opinion, have been indifferent for too long. Maybe I'll ask you, Deborah, if you could answer that.
So I would say, in my personal opinion, that it definitely, most definitely should be part of the inquiry. I think that there should be an independent inquiry into our policing services, RCMP level and the provincial levels as well for our police services, and that there be a matrix and accountability for performances therein. Sometimes when we release reports, whether that be police reports or CMP reports, externally to the media, it can be misleading, as we've recently seen in the Colton Boucher case. And I know in my own personal experiences that I've been subject to some of that discrimination as well from policing services. So it is real, it does exist. We may not like to know that it does, but it does. And I think it needs to be a big piece of the inquiry, along with the child welfare services as well.
I feel the same as well, knowing and going through some situations as a young person growing up in the prairies, getting stopped and ID'd for no reason, just being brown and being in a place where there's a lot of Indigenous people. And so not just that, there's also been some other situations where, there needs to be an external policing body that investigates the RCMP and other police in this country. Because we know from some of the stories that have been told that it's not just an external thing. They're there to serve and protect, but a lot of our people feel it's opposite in our community. And so why is that? Normally people would run to the police, and in our community there's a really feeling of mistrust, and so that has to be fixed.
What are your thoughts on that, Richard? Do you think that the police, the RCMP specifically, should be a part of this bigger inquiry?
Well, I am happy that the terms of reference include the policing as part of the investigation. So I'm glad it's being done because, as you just heard, it's a core part of what needs to change in our society. I'm glad that they have made the terms of reference broad enough because I think we have to look at the police and child welfare has been mentioned, but I think we have to look at all the structural reasons why these things happen. One of the things that's kind of let people off the hook is that they look at the women who have been murdered and they make judgments about that individual. Say something, she was vulnerable because, and then there's some end to that sentence that somehow implies it's something about her that led to her being murdered, which I think is abusive. I worked in the area of child sexual abuse for many years as a social worker, and I heard that with all the kids I worked with who were sexually abused, somehow that they were responsible for the abuse. Well, I hear the same language now. I hear the same language about, they're vulnerable because, and I immediately have a reaction to that because to me, we have to take a look at what are all the things that happened that drew that person, the pushes and the pulls that drew that person into that situation. There's an old saying when I was a kid that there but for the grace of God go I. And I've always kind of remembered that because I truly believe that had I been born in that place, in that situation, I too would have been in that place. And so we have to say, well, what was that place in that situation? What are the reasons why people end up disproportionately vulnerable? And I think that means we look at everything. We look at all the services that are provided by government. We look at all the relationships between different groups in our society. We look at economics. We look at families. We look at racism. We look at history. We look at opportunity. All of those things are on the table from my perspective.
Well, I think that there's so much influence when it comes to this inquiry. I mean, the government, the politicians are a big influence, but so is the media. Nicole, with your background in the media, do you think that there is still that division, that separation between mainstream media and the Aboriginal communities that might have exacerbated the lack of attention to this topic?
I would say that there, in the past and currently, that there needs to be much more engagement and also an understanding of maybe an education for mainstream media as to our community and different protocols so that there's more of a relationship building there. Because I know when I worked in mainstream media, I was given all the Indigenous stories, being an Indigenous woman. But there's times where I wanted to tell mainstream stories. But I know that, some television stations and others are now stepping up, like the Toronto Star, went above and beyond. I'm also on the other side now of telling stories and selling the idea to reporters to come out and cover our stories. So it's much better. You see so many more Indigenous people, organizations putting out press releases where you didn't see that 20 years ago. And so you have much more people working in communications, which is so great to see that we are taking charge of our own stories as natural storytellers, and that there needs to be definitely some improvement in terms of the media, because, just looking at last week and Colton Bushy, as Deborah was mentioning, I read from one media outlet that there was the report that it essentially had said that the Indigenous men were on the property because they're there to steal something, or there was an understanding of that. And so, when you get a report from the RCMP stating that, some reporters take it for what it is because it's coming from an authority figure or an authority organization. And maybe that's a question back to you as a reporter. Do you question those reports at all? And do you know any others that have gone that extra mile to say, well, this can't be correct, or perhaps it's misleading?
Well, certainly. I mean, when you think of the RCMP, I mean, they're an institution. So you sort of just have that default trust. It's like, these are the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They are an authority. They are, a figure that we have grown up with to respect and look up to. And it wasn't but as a journalist, it's also ingrained for us to have critical thinking. So it's that balance. It's like, well, what boundaries can I push? How far do we question it? How far should I be skeptical? Am I being skeptical just because I'm a reporter? And I didn't really start to have that shred of mistrust, and I know that we were talking about it in the back, until the case of Robert Pickton. And it legitimately scared me when it all started unraveling and the backstories came out about how long the RCMP knew who this guy was, that women from the sex trade were saying, we know who he is, we can take you to his farm, we can, had identified him. And it just, the indifference, I guess, is maybe the most politically correct word that I could use, of how far that went on and how many women were murdered in that span of time, that they could have had this guy in custody and these women would have survived. But so that worried me, and that started me questioning maybe the intentions of the RCMP. Maybe are they biased? Maybe do they have discrimination of their own? I mean, they're human. So yes, I think that we can't stop questioning. I mean, there has to be a line, but I do think that there needs to be some accountability, maybe, and that's probably what that is our job.
If I can add to that, so I think that we have to sometimes compare, or at least I know that I do, mainstream media coverage to Indigenous news coverages. So we do have some networks like APTN that do reporting. We also have social media, right? So we're not just talking about the external news stations. We also have social media, which is very powerful, and quite often. So again, we compare. If we take the Colton example of recent, we need to ask ourselves, quite honestly, if that was 4 white boys that went into a reserve and the same incident occurred, what would have been the coverage on that? What would be happening? What report would the RCMP have released? And honestly ask ourselves that question, because there would be a difference, right? I think media is very powerful, and I think that, and we'll probably get into this later, but if we could have more allies and Indigenous people doing reporting, so that we can have those non-biased truth stories out there that will further educate Canadians.
Well, and I think a lot of it, too, is a learning curve. I mean, I've worked years trying to sort of bridge those gaps between the media and the Aboriginal communities, because I know that there is a mistrust. And I had one elder tell me, he's like, you've got all these strikes against you. You're white and you're a woman. I thought, this is going to be a lot. This is going to be uphill. And it was, but I just felt like, I'm constantly feeling like I have to prove, like, I can be an ally. I am someone to trust, because I do think that there are so many stories on the reserve, off the reserve, within the Aboriginal community that we need to be telling. And I just wish there was more of a symbiotic relationship, that maybe there was a comfortability, that people knew that, okay, that's kind of in my wheelhouse. Those are the stories I like to tell. So come to me, pitch me something. It might not come to fruition, but it might. And I do think that that's sort of, we're almost there. We just kind of need to turn the corner. Sometimes I feel like we're going 1 step forward and then 2 steps back. But I do think that the onus is on us to just, I guess, keep going, keep making those strides, because I do think that it's close, it's there, and I think that, there has to be more of us, though. More of us willing to want to tell those stories that are considered on the fringes, maybe the marginalized communities, because they deserve a voice, because traditionally they haven't had one. Mm-hmm. Richard, what do you think about how the media has I guess, covered this topic in terms of the missing and murdered?
Well, the media is I'm trying to think of a simple way of saying it, but it is simply a reflection of much bigger factors in our society. They are who they are because of where they came from and who's at the table. Just watch television or listen to radio and look how many non-male white voices there are. I mean, you're an exception in some ways, right? And these are the exceptions here. For the most part, most of us speak from the history we come from. And if you end up by gathering this group of people from one very narrow sliver section of society, and then you expect them to talk for a broader society, you're being naive. And I think that that's part of the issue. It's not only the families in this case needing to have a voice, but it's the whole community needing to have a voice on this issue, but every other issue. And so where are they when it comes to the anchors on our television shows? Where are they when it comes to the people who get the columns in the newspaper? They're not there. And traditional media has, at best has assigned somebody to take responsibility for that, but very rarely have gone to the communities, whether it happens to be Indigenous communities or any other communities, and said, we don't want to assign somebody, we want you to assign somebody. We want you to tell us who can speak for you so that that voice can be brought out in the places that we have control over media. And that doesn't happen, almost never. And I think until we start doing that, until we start going to the Indigenous community and saying, who does speak for you? And then providing them the forums, those very powerful forums that Deborah was saying, then we're going to continue to have a singular voice.
And I think a lot of it comes from past stereotypes, past ideologies about the Aboriginal community and sort of that separation. Maybe I'll start with you, Deborah. I mean, what do you think we, not just media, but we as the greater community can do to sort of break down some of those barriers and eliminate some of those existing stereotypes? Because they're there, whether or not anybody wants to admit it or not.
Yeah, I think everybody has stereotypes, and you don't have to be any certain race or color or religion to certainly have stereotypes. I think it's the awareness that matters. So I think Canadians can begin to overcome stereotypes always by getting truly educated, right, on what is the real history of Canada, what is the real history of the Indigenous people in Canada. And that will help to educate and further explain why some Indigenous people are where they are in life. And so if you can understand, if you're aware and you can understand, then you start to go, aha, and then you maybe become an ally. Maybe you share that education and that awareness, and it dispels your stereotype or your myth that you grew up with. Because don't forget that some Canadians are growing up exposed to different ways of thinking as well. So just like Indigenous people may have grown up with some tradition and culture, and we have certain ways that we think, so does everybody else in Canada. So it's a journey. I think it really comes down to education and awareness and being willing to step outside your box and learn the history and the education.
Well, it has been, just even from my personal experience, gratifying seeing those light bulb moments in people when you start to talk about, like when I grew up in school, I had never heard anything about what was happening in the residential school system. And it was embarrassing that I didn't know. And I thought, I'm only learning about this now in my mid-20s, early 30s. Or how is this even possible that this legacy of trauma had happened and nobody had told us about it? And it's like when you start, really unraveling that and peeling back the layers and letting people know this is, think about if this just happened in your own family. The impact and the reach that it would have if this had happened just within your immediate family. But think about a generations of people. And then you start to kind of open up and it's like, okay, it's not that, we give people an excuse because of maybe the choices that they make, but I think that there's some explanation as to why maybe they make the choices that they make in some ways. And I mean, Richard, what have you encountered, stereotypes? I'm sure you have. And what do you think that we can do to sort of get over that hump?
Well, I think you're both pointing out something that's very important. We don't know anything about our own history. You know, when I go and talk to people, just, you know, outside of my formal work, but everybody knows I'm Minister of Indigenous Relations, so I go and ride a boat on the lake, and the person sitting next to me says, so, you know, you get all of these kind of conversations. And then I just bite my lip because I know what's about to happen. And I always just start to introduce facts into the conversation that throws people away. I say, well, are you aware when the last residential school closed in the country? And if I were to ask them, give me a number, think about it yourself, think of a number, most people would say, well, probably in 64, you know, and I just look at them and say, try in 1990s, the last one closed in the country. In 1980s, the last one closed in Alberta. And there's just a stunned look. So I can look at them and say, while you were in school, Indigenous people were in residential school, same time, exactly the same. And people are stunned by that, you know, or say things like, you know, they talk about, well, how come there are no running businesses and stuff? Are you aware that we had a law in Canada that said Indigenous people were not allowed to own a business? And that law didn't get resolved until I was old enough to own a business? You know, it's not a long ago problem. A friend of mine at the University of Calgary, Dr. Rick Enns, has done a lot of research on residential schools. He's been an expert witness in some trials across Canada. And one of the things he likes to remind us of is the fact that he went back to the House of Commons debates on residential schools around the turn of the century, and I'm talking early 1900s. And there were reports from some of the MPs at the time saying, we are hearing that kids that go to residential schools are much more highly likely to die an early death. And they were reading the names of dozens of kids who had gone to school, and by the time they were 15, they were dead. And this is over 100 years ago, that the issue of this is killing people, not just it's not a good thing, or philosophically we don't like it. This is killing people. It's 100 years since that's been reported in the House of Commons. It took us 100 years to respond to death. You know, how do you explain that?
Yeah, that's powerful when you put it in that way. Nicole, what's your take on the sort of the barriers that are sometimes seem like mountains?
Well, the barriers that our community faces is, number one, I would say poverty is at the core of it. The lack of opportunities. But despite that, there's also people that I know that are even here today that have gone and did stuff and have overcome the odds. And a lot of us in our communities, although we are deemed successful from mainstream, you know, we still go through and hear things on a weekly or monthly basis of major trauma, stuff that, you know, you wouldn't hear around a family table hardly ever in Canadian society. And so that's another thing I would have to say is that, you know, as Indigenous women, there's so many things that we've overcome. And looking at some of the stereotypes, I really believe that it started when the Hudson's Bay Mining and Smelting Company first arrived on the shores of Canada. And our women were essentially raped and seen as subhuman. Also, Pocahontas, for lack of a better word, or it's been awful. You know, it's been since that time. There's been a misconception all the way, and this has been taught from generation to generation, from grandfather to father to son, and we see that. We still see that now, and you know, it's something that we as Canadians, we have to talk about this. We have to, for the next generation of young Indigenous girls that are coming up, they need to have a safer country to live in. I am really determined to have these discussions and to look at not only why, but who, and also then with the National Inquiry, you know, I've covered inquiries as a former reporter. There needs to be, outside of the inquiry, people need to get charged. There needs to be actual criminal charges that these people face. Justice needs to be served. Like, that's what we want to see. That's what I personally want to see. Because it's gone on too long. I look at this country and there's a lot of people. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's gone on too long. And the thing is that we as human citizens that live in this country, you know, it's time that we all speak up, you know. We have to look at ways of trying to come together, because we're not only facing this, we're facing actual other things that are coming at us. You know, as Indigenous people, we're also very interconnected with the environment, and there's other things that you know, that we face, and that's a whole other topic for another day. But for this specifically, I really think that with the inquiry, I'm very happy that the new government does see it as a social phenomenon, as the old government was ushered out. And I'm very happy, because looking at it, you know, it was an uphill battle, you know, we fought during those 10 years, during that regime. And it was hard, you know. I was very much a part of the Idle No More movement at Victoria Island, and there's so many other stories I could tell you of the things that I went through behind the scenes. But I really realize that this time right now is very sacred, and of course we want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So,
I mean, do you think that there needs to be an Alberta-specific role? Like, I know this is a federal government initiative, but Richard, where do you think that our province has specifically our responsibility as a province when it comes to the inquiry?
Well, this is the first time we've had what can actually be described as a national inquiry. We've had federal inquiries before, but you need to understand that what's happening now is we actually don't have just one inquiry going on. There are one set of commissioners, but they are being given inquiry status in every single province and territory across this country. So in Alberta, they're given full status as an Alberta inquiry. We are just simply adopting the same people so that there aren't, you know, people at cross purposes. So the same commissioners will come in here, but they're given full status, and we actually have an Alberta inquiry or reflective of the national inquiry working together. And I think that's important, because I think that it's not about Alberta sitting back and watching the federal government and saying, gee, I hope they do something right here. It's about Alberta stepping up and saying, this is our inquiry. We want everything to happen in a way that will lead to some real outcomes, as they're talking about. And as a result, we take very seriously our role in making sure that they have all the authority that they need, that they have all the records that they need, and that we are working with the families to make sure that they are able to have a voice. We just had a meeting on Saturday with many of the families, and our questions were to them were, what is it you need from us to make sure that as this inquiry goes along, that you actually are participants in it? Because if they're not participants, it's going to be another mistake.
What do you think it says about our country, or maybe as a society, that this inquiry is taking place? Deborah?
I think that, you know, I'm going to echo what Nicole mentioned earlier, that this has been a long time coming, and it should have happened 10 years ago when it was originally asked, for sure. You know, but we can't change what is done is done. I think that we could have 1,100,000 panels like this. We have thousands and thousands of voices out there that can speak to this and the inquiry. We have families that are affected. We have allies. We have our traditional people, our traditional lawmakers. So I think that what I hope, and it probably won't happen in my lifetime, and it may not happen in my daughter's, it may not, but I would like to eventually be at a point with the outcomes of this inquiry that Canada is more educated and that Indigenous women are less at risk and safe, because it is hard to exist knowing that you're more at risk just because of something. If you're, as an example, I could say if you have blue eyes, you're going to be targeted because you have blue eyes. Doesn't matter who you are, your education, your upbringing, but you have blue eyes, so you are going to be more at risk than somebody with brown eyes. So that's an example of something you have absolutely no control over. And so I'd love to see that my daughter is safe, and my grandchildren are safe for the future generations.
I mean, what is that like, being an Aboriginal woman, knowing that there's such a disproportionate number of women that are preyed upon, targeted, victimized because of their cultural background? Like, I'm naive, like I don't even want to pretend to know what that's like, but how would you articulate that?
How would I articulate that? So I think it is you are more conscious, you are more aware where you go, what you do, what city you're in, who you're interacting with. You're more hypervigilant to subtle racism. So there's not a lot of overt, direct racism that we may encounter, but there's subtle racisms. And so I don't put myself in risky situations if I'm in a certain city that I know in an area. You're just more aware of yourself and who you are, and not to put yourself in risky situations.
What's it
like? That perhaps, a non-Indigenous person wouldn't have to worry about.
I would say even as a mother, we're much more strict with our Indigenous children, especially girls, that say a non-Indigenous girl wouldn't have, for say sleepovers or whatever it might be. It's just you're just that much more aware because your daughter does look Indigenous, and you don't ever want anything, obviously bad to happen. So you're much more aware and much more protective. I always say like a mother bear, and sincerely that. I would say even more of a grizzly bear. But anyways, that and also I'll share really quickly. When I was down in North Dakota just a couple months ago, you probably, I don't know if you've seen, but Trump had called the Senator Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. I was the lady that stood up in the press conference and called them out on it and said, yes, I find that offensive. Yes. So I, in that very moment, as an Indigenous woman, said, enough's enough. Like, I'm sorry, I don't care if you're Donald Trump or if you're like the king of whatever, England, I'm going to say what I have to say. Because we're in a time where that's enough. We've had enough. We've hit a wall. We are no longer going to accept what was accepted in this country. And we're going to do, by all means, everything we can do to protect and to create awareness and to allow Canadians and to invite them in this discussion. Not to get militant or anything, but to look at ways of trying to overcome this together in this country. Because I know that there's a lot of people that are non-Indigenous that, when they read these stories in the media, they go, what? Like, how could this happen? Or, there's a lot of, I would say, even guilt in some cases, and it's not even their fault, but because of how things have unrolled in this country in terms of the history, I always try to say that, you're an ambassador everywhere you go as an Indigenous person, whether you like it or not, because we're 3% of the population. You are you're an ambassador to your own community and for the rest of the world. So,
I mean, you touched on it, and it's just has sparked a question. I guess just in terms of that balance of their maybe outward displays of their heritage. I mean, you want your daughters, your sons to be proud of their heritage and to honor it. But it's a different type of parallel. I just remember seeing a news article in the States just with this whole Black Lives Matter movement. And there was a group of fathers who made a concerted effort to have their sons not dress a certain way. They said, you can't wear sweatshirts with lettering. You shouldn't be wearing a baseball cap backwards. You shouldn't be wearing slouchy jeans. Because you should be dressing preppy. Because anything that we can eliminate for you to encounter being targeted by police, we are going to do. And I'm not saying that maybe, a woman's outward display of their heritage or their culture makes them a target, but I don't know. Like, do you know the question that I'm asking? Like,
yes.
Is that considered?
With me, definitely. I ensure that there's appropriate dressing that's going on. I always scan in public places to see if someone's looking at her in a different way. I'm very observant. It's just within me to see that, because I've seen so much in my time being a reporter, and the things that I've heard, that you can't be just too safe, I would say, and maybe a little bit hyper safe.
Better to err on the side of caution always, though.
Yeah.
Isn't that part of the tragedy, though? I mean, the fact that a mother has to make any decision at all about what her daughter wears. I mean,
exactly.
That's fundamentally a sign of Canada has a funny kind of racism sometimes. I mean, it's a bit of a quieter racism than what happens in the States sometimes. But it's a kind of racism that, I might not look at you and call you a name, but I just don't look at you at all. And that's equally as devastating a racism. And if you have to protect yourself and your daughter by doing that every single day, we got a problem.
Deborah, do you take extra steps in terms of that?
Well, I think it's just as a mother in general, of course, that you're protective with your daughters, as anybody would be, of course. Now, my daughter is not as dark as I am. I agree that the States with the Black Lives Matter is a different context, a different movement. In Canada, I think I'm proud to see our people demonstrating their pride in the culture and wearing their braids, and the men wearing the braids, and being allowed and proud of who we are, because for so many years and generations we were not allowed to be Indian. So I don't think we should be at risk because we're Indian, anymore.
I know, and I think about braids, there is such a beautiful expression, because when I was talking to some elders who were survivors of the residential schools, that was so traumatic, was that they had their braids cut off. And it was like, that was just more than a security blanket, like that was my everything. And I just thought, what a crime that now we're telling people or assuming that people aren't allowed to express themselves in that way, to be proud of their Native heritage, because it makes them a target. I just think that's sort of a sad, really depressing dichotomy that we've
got. It's a hard balance to maintain, for sure.
Yeah.
That's one thing I want to mention, is that, though, on the brighter side of things, I got my daughter started in dancing, like power dancing, before she could walk. And so she's been dancing for many years. And so I started dancing because of her, and wanted to role model that, because I didn't grow up in the power circle. And so I really believe that, that helps to really, for this up-and-coming generation, I really believe that they're going to do so much better things than our generation, and that's just because of the intergenerational trauma that we've come through with residential schools and many other things that have affected our community. So I believe that there is hope, and we're creating hope by these things that we're doing now. And I really believe that with the government as well, the province, and specifically the federal government, they realize and recognize these things as well. So we're much more ahead, I really see, in Canada than it is in the U.S. I definitely, from what I went through and what I had asked in that press conference, I realized that, it's good, but it's not awesome. I want things to be absolutely fabulous. But of course, that's me in my rose-colored glasses, right? I want to be living in a country where, we're going to have a First Nations woman that will be a prime minister, right? We'll have, yeah. That's going to be awesome. In fact, that's one of the goals of my daughter, right? So we have to raise these women to be proud women and to understand their role and to understand some of the risks, but also to understand that there's beauty. There's still beauty and humor. We never have lost that. So I'm so fortunate that we're a part of this community, and we also, welcome others within our community.
That's great. I don't see Brian anywhere. Oh, there you are. Okay. Oh, I didn't know if it was like time for audience questions. I'm getting kind of, not yet. Okay. Well, maybe you guys have 5 minutes, so you got time to think about a real burning question that you wanted to ask anybody. I guess with this inquiry, we're talking a lot about stereotypes. And I know that you've brought it up a few times, Nicole, about, just sort of this perception that Aboriginal women are subhuman, they're discarded, they're unworthy. Do you think that this inquiry will change that narrative, or maybe just the fact that the inquiry is happening is already changing that narrative to say, you know what, they are worth our attention, and they are worth a really deeper investigation into finding out what is happening to these women and why they are becoming prey? Do you think that we're making strides in that regard?
I would say yes. I would say that an inquiry says that there's a problem. It validates that.
Yeah.
It actually says, you know what, we have a problem in this country and we need to look at it. And I believe that through the inquiry, we will hear details. Details help people to bring up imagery when they, as you know, when they hear stories. And so for people that can imagine, what a woman went through, or even a child, because that's one portion that we really haven't discussed is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so, I really believe that with this inquiry, that images like this won't ever happen again. Like that to me is an awful, awful picture. It's a bunch of RCMP, and there's a woman on her knees holding eagle feather and trying to stop them. You've probably seen this many a times. But she was trying to, this was in Quebec, and it was over land. And so that's also, another issue. But like I said, the environment is another thing. But I wanted to make mention, we have a couple of minutes, really quickly. I had a discussion with the RCMP this past year in the fall in Edmonton. And I said to them, why is it that you haven't put out a public service announcement to the broader public on the, what is it we're at now? Probably about 10 or 11 women that have been found close to, in and around south of Edmonton. Their bodies have been found in this area. And I said, this is the markings of a serial killer. I said, although, this stems back to how many years, I said, why is it that you haven't done that? And of course, I was faced with some bullying, and it was supposed to be a sort of a bully-free zone. but it wasn't. A gentleman turned around and said, "Excuse me, you don't know, you know, for instance, the lady I was talking about that disappeared in 2012, 4 years ago, you know, hitchhiking from, I think it was Nisku to Edmonton, you know, the details, and the high-risk lifestyle that she had." And I said, "Excuse me, are you saying that by hitchhiking she deserved to get murdered?" And then another RCMP said, "Some of that information is classified." And I said, I just walked out. I was so angry because, you know, I was the only Indigenous woman sitting there, and I was trying to, you know, they were just, anyways, it was a bad situation. And I was really upset because when you look at this map, you think to yourself, we have a problem in this province. You know, we really do. And it's not specifically, I would say, yeah, the RCMP have a lot to answer to. And I realize that there's so many questions that I would have personally. And yeah, hearing the truth is so important to me. So without further ado.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good timing.
All right. Thank you very much to our panel for a very riveting discussion. Okay. I'd now like to open up the floor to a Q&A session with our panelists and moderators. So if you could look towards the aisle, you will see 2 GlobalFest volunteers with microphones for you to ask questions, and they will come to you. However, you will have to meet them in the middle of the aisle, and I just ask that you keep your questions to within 20 to 30 seconds. If you have a story to share, please save it for the networking discussion, which we'll be having over food at about 5:30 or so. And please do not touch the microphone and leave time for other people to ask their questions. So one question at a time. So who would like to ask the first question? Yeah.
I'd like to know in this inquiry if the commission is made up of all white men or if there are elders and First Nations and women involved.
Well, I can tell you that there are 5 members in the inquiry. We can make the particular names available to you. 4 of them are First Nations people. 1 of them is a man. And 1 of them is a white woman who has been a lawyer in the North and does speak Inuktitut herself, has been involved. So there is a bit of a range. You know, there's always going to be concerns about who's on the commission. I think that you'll find that the commission members are at least a very strong and reasonable group of people, and there are hundreds of others who could have been on there as well.
And I think they also, correct me if I'm wrong, but do they not also have a elder consultation group as well? Right. That's going to help with the commissioners. So I think that is key, so that we have that traditional law and that traditional knowledge incorporated to the work that the commissioners are going to do as well.
There.
Hi, I have a question. My father was the father of 15 children. I am the youngest. And he was sent to jail for buying alcohol for a reserve native. And he was given a 2-year jail sentence. And during that time, child welfare came in and removed all the children from my mom. And I'm wondering if things like that are still occurring today, and have the laws been changed as far as jail sentencing and Aboriginals? Is anyone monitoring that?
I mean, I don't.
So the question being is that, are we buying our own alcohol now, or is it more child welfare stuff?
Is anyone watching the sentences that are given to Aboriginal people?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. Actually, I don't know the exact statistics at the moment, but definitely Aboriginal people are overrepresented in our incarceration and in our jails and in our systems, and they're quite often given longer and more penalizing sentences and fines than non-Indigenous populations. And I think that has been proven in various studies and reports. Yeah.
Over here, take some questions over here.
I was just wondering, should the inquiry be more open to different places where the people can learn things rather than they're sitting home and not showing their hatred without knowing the things?
Well, the inquiry will be happening all across the country, in every province and every territory. They will be physically present. They'll have access to all of the records in every province and every territory, and they'll be having public meetings in every province and every territory. One of the things I think is important to remember is that the inquiry is only one finger of a bigger piece, that we need all the fingers active at the same time. And those 5 commissioners, they're just doing one piece of it. We also need the community to do all the rest. We need people like yourselves out there having these conversations, people like yourselves learning about why is it that we're even in this place, that we need this inquiry, and being active. The only reason why we have an inquiry is because of the Indigenous women in this country being active. It's that simple. Eventually the government caught up. But this is where the real action is here. These are the people that make something happen. And I think that everybody in this room has a responsibility to learn about this inquiry, to share that knowledge with other people. And I invite you to be one of them.
We had a question in this aisle.
Yeah. I think the RCMP have had a long enough kick at the cat here. Isn't it time the federal government turned this over to the UN and investigate it as what it is, genocide?
Ooh, absolutely. Yeah. There is a permanent forum at the UN on Indigenous issues, and in fact, that's where Dr. Wilton Littlechild and many others have helped to draft the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I believe that, as I was mentioning, an outside body needs to come in and investigate, and that would be probably the best place to try and bring together international police force that would look at investigating, say, this country's policing authorities.
Hi, thank you for being here today and speaking and sharing your wisdom with us. My question is, being an Indigenous woman, how do I support other Indigenous women to go into the police force or the RCMP or our tribal police?
So I can take a stab at that. So my background is working in the prior in the oil and gas industry at a time when there wasn't a lot of Indigenous people in general, but with the intent to make change within. So if I think of that as having Indigenous women into our police force, I think that would only, it would be a challenge, absolutely, but I think it would benefit in the longer term sustainable outcomes of having that. And so we need to encourage our sisters, our change makers, our warrior women that are willing to, go forth and pave that path, right, for our children and our daughters that are going to come up so that it's safer for them.
I see a question in the back.
Hi there. You were talking about stereotypes and confronting stereotypes, and you were also discussing Indigenous voices in the media. And you said that when discussing stereotypes with other people, you often just counter those by relating your own experiences and talking about facts and what reality is instead of how it is perceived. Do you think that having more Indigenous voices in the media and hearing more from Indigenous people, and instead of just hearing about them, would counter those stereotypes and help? And if so, how do you think we can work towards that?
So I believe that absolutely we need more Indigenous people in mainstream media. I know that, when you tell a story, you come with your own set of experiences, as unbiased as that is. You try to come to the table with a very balanced story, but of course your own experiences are going to, tell a different story that I would tell, to what Jill would tell. And I believe that programs like the University of First Nations University in Regina, they have a specific Indigenous communications program there for up-and-coming journalists. There is CBC Aboriginal. I know there's many people like Duncan McHugh, she's retired now, Carla Robinson. She was an anchor on CBC National. And so we have people in the media, and we need to just keep having more, inviting more to partake in some of those stories. I know as a reporter working in mainstream, it was quite hard a lot of times telling stories that, were, I would say, hard on the soul, on the spirit, to be telling, because of your connection to it, and knowing the suffering and stuff that has occurred. But I really believe that our people are very visual and natural storytellers, and there's so many young people now that are drawn to that because of social media, and because they now every day tell a story with their status updates and with their tweets, and so it's in our community. If you ever want to find out what's going on, you just go on Facebook and you got it within an hour, of what's happening, and it's a different way of telling stories. But absolutely, I really believe that there should be more Indigenous people involved in mainstream media.
There is a huge inequity. Just in my career, I've only ever worked with one Native reporter, and I often tell, I talked a lot about bridging these gaps between the non-Native and the Native communities, and how do we do that? And I think that allies are just as important. I take a lot of pride in the stories that I tell within the LGBTQ community. I'm just as important as an ally. I might not be lesbian, but I can still sort of have that voice and be that voice for them. But I can't do it alone. Allies aren't enough. We have, it's not really a scholarship, but an internship type program at Global News, and where it is specifically geared towards aspiring Aboriginal journalists, and they come and they intern, and I want to take them under my wing because I want to be able to inspire them to come back. I mean, maybe, we don't hire them right from internship, but a lot of these young people who have come through, I never see them again. And I always wonder, where did they go? Did I turn them off of this industry? But I mean, it's tough too, because, a lot of people, and this isn't Aboriginal specific, I had to start small. Because you don't just graduate and then launch into Calgary. I mean, but all these smaller, because of the ever-evolving industry of media, smaller stations are closing down. They just don't have the budgets to keep them open. So there's harder places to kind of cut your teeth and, rub off some of your green a little bit. But I do hope that we see more of that in terms of the Aboriginal community, and I hope that they want to be, because you are so right when they are natural storytellers. And, I mean, we could be learning something from them, too.
One question here, then two questions down here.
Hi, Jill.
Hello. Sorry, I don't know where it's so dark. Oh, there you are. Yeah. Hello.
Long time no see. 16x9 did a story last year. It's been aired a couple of times on Shannon Stream. about the going to schools and not having, well, you guys know the stuff anyway. But I would challenge Global Calgary to do more internal stories like that. You know, we have a lot of people here that I volunteer with, who work with, who could give some great stories. Jill, you're the one to do this. So I challenge you to get some stories going with these natural storytellers. And if you need some help, I'll give you the contact.
Challenge accepted.
All right, thanks, Jill.
You guys are my witness. Oh, no, I'm just kidding. I would love that. I mean, the tragedy is that 16 by 9, because of budget cuts, is now no longer in existence. So that is sort of limiting our ability as a journalist to sort of have that bigger venue for us to share those stories on a national scope. And I guess it worries me thinking, like, maybe is there not the appetite for that anymore? Does the audience not want this sort of longer treatment investigative? I still think they do. And I guess it's, you know, I mean, starting with Calgary, I mean, and then we can shop the stories elsewhere is sort of what we have to do. It's just the budgets and the time aren't there. I mean, we're in a Twitter, Facebook world. Everybody wants everything in 120 characters. Otherwise, they're bored. So, you know, it's like, how do we keep people's attention? But I do think that there still is that hunger from people, that they still want these sort of longer treatment investigative stories. And I'm still going for it. So thanks, Hillary.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. There were two down here.
Hi, at the beginning you talked about mistrust in police forces. Do you know if any of the police forces around the country are tracking the race of the people that they talk to in the context of their authority, you know, to determine the extent of the problem and how it's trending, whether it's getting worse or better?
Yes, they are.
Nicole?
Yeah. They, from what I was told, obviously I don't work in the force, but from some of the stats that we've been keeping track of, and there's many, for instance, the Institute for the Advancement of Aboriginal Women, they have been doing some work. Also, the Native Women's Association of Canada, they had the Sisters in Spirit campaign, which specifically looked at missing and murdered Indigenous women. So there is definitely, they are tracking. But the thing is that our women are so varied in skin color, eye color, hair color. Nowadays, you know, I get mistaken many times for everything brown under the sun. So, and I'm Cree and Scottish and a little bit of Ukrainian. So the thing is, though, I really believe that it's hard for RCMP or police to actually say, well, this person is, you know, whatever, unless they self-identify from what we've been looking at. And I want to make mention, too, just before, so I don't forget, is that a friend of mine who is in the hospital right now, we're praying for Lisa Meaches. She's been in the media for at least 25 to 30 years, and she is, you know, was putting together a story or a documentary style television program called Taken. And it's specifically retracing the steps of these missing and murdered Indigenous women, like America's Most Wanted, so doing reenactments. And so that's supposed to air on APTN, and I'm really hoping and praying that she's going to come through and make it, and, you know, that this program will go to air, because it's really needed. We really need to, we need Canadians as well to see what has occurred, you know, in the last, leading up to the last days or hours of these women that have gone missing or murdered. So
I think also an answer to that question is, so an RCM report indicated, you know, 1,200-ish, right? And then, you know, when Carolyn Bennett went on The pre-inquiry, we find out that it's 4,000. So that's quite a big difference. So where is that discrepancy coming from? You know, are police services only counting the cases that they open and deem, Indigenous? So, and is there cases that are not reported, right, to the police services? So, and I know that NWAC, the Native Women's Association of Canada, also has done reports as well on the numbers. So there is some discrepancies, but I think the point is it's overwhelming and it needs to stop. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. I think that's all the time that we have now for Q&A. So if you have a question or a statement you'd like to make towards GlobalFest or towards our panel, please do stay for the post-discussion wind-down and for a little bit of decompression. And speaking of feedback, if you look inside of your programs, you will all have a survey, which you can fill out in the foyer with pens and pencils. That gives us feedback on what we can do best to serve you as our community. We'd love to hear from you. Or you can tell it to our face. And I'd like to pass it along to our panelists and our moderator one last time for a closing statement on the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So we'll start with our moderator, Ms. Jill Courteau.
That's me. I'll just keep it brief. I mean, I hadn't really scripted a closing remark because I wanted it to be a bit more organic just as a result of the conversation. And I think that it has been really intriguing, enlightening for me. And I know that it's sort of my responsibility and my job to sort of make these stories of these missing and murdered Indigenous women more relatable. And I will take that. I do take that to heart. And I think that I'm just really in awe of the commitment and the compassion of Indigenous women who have brought this story to light. Because without that, I mean, we wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't be having this inquiry. And I think that that's evidence that once we create a movement, we put our heart and soul into it, change can happen.
Okay. And Nicole.
I really enjoyed this time here. I think that we need next time to have a very full theater. I believe that there is hope when we really come together and also have so much. I really believe that there's going to be justice. I know just from I would say that having a connection to the Creator is really important, and for me, that's been my go-to, and has given me the strength to talk about things like this, and to also have that voice, to be that voice. And so I look forward to this country when the inquiry's over, and when we're looking at a new way of paving it forward, and when you see little kids, for instance, that they all don't have those stories that have been passed down from their mother or father, and that it's something that, you know, sort of has been, that was the past, and here we are now in this present day where, you know, this is an Indigenous woman, but it's not just by her skin color. It's something that that's beautiful. That is that's so opposite to what is happening right now. So I'm very hopeful for that future, and I'm hopeful for my daughter to see that in her time, or even my grandchildren, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And Richard. Richard.
Well, I feel like I've said it before, but it's really important to me that we recognize that this is a tragedy, and it's a Canadian tragedy, and that every one of us here who calls themselves a Canadian, that means it's you. And you need to be a participant. It's that simple. And so I invite you. No commission can resolve the problems. That's not their role. They're not going to go back and solve the crimes. They're not going to go back and make it all disappear. It's the community that's going to make things change. And if you don't participate, it's all by itself and it gets lost. So participate.
And last but certainly not least, Ms. Deborah Green.
Yeah, so I'm just want to reiterate that we could have 100 of these similar panels. We could have thousands of other people that have been impacted by missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I think my challenge out to Canadians is to do your own research, be your own educator, look at the government of Canada's website and everything that is on there for information about the inquiry. Look for the social media, Facebook, Twitter, Indigenous groups and posts, and watch APTN News once in a while to get the other side of the stories. I do hope that the inquiry makes sustainable long-term change, and that there's some justice and closure for some families that have been impacted, and that over time we can change this history, and our future generations can be safe.
Okay. All right, so that concludes day 2 of the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum presented by TD. I am Brian Francisco, Program Manager of GlobalFest, and thank you all for coming out here tonight.